Welcome to Control Alt Delete Humanity. My name is Adriana and I am here with my co host Teddy
Hi.
and Becca.
Hello.
I chose this topic because eugenics both terrifies and fascinates me. It raises raw, uncomfortable questions like who gets to decide what better humanity looks like, and why do we keep flirting with these dangerous ideas under new names? Growing up, I saw how ideas about superiority, whether about race, ability, or intelligence, still lingered beneath the surface of everyday life. Eugenics isn't some relic of the past, it has simply just evolved. Is eugenics a good science offering hope and healing, or is it a dangerous path toward control, exclusion, and equality? That's the conversation that we're going to be diving into today. With the personal reflection, I would like to say that when I grew up, I never really imagined that the dark history of eugenics would echo into my lifetime up until now. But looking back, maybe the signs were already there. I remember my grandmother telling me that my mother had always ruined their white pure family. She grew up believing that certain races were simply superior to others. I'm not saying that she was a terrible person or anything, but that was just how a lot of people thought back in that day. And before her passing, she realized that she was wrong. But again, back then, eugenics was more focused on the race and ethnicity, tied slightly into the mental capabilities. Today, in 2025, the conversation hasn't really disappeared, it's just shifted. Instead of targeting specifically just race, it's about conditions like autism, ADHD, and Down syndrome. While race is still a lingering topic, and it does still in fact happen, I do want to focus on the mental health concept since it's a current topic in debate as of now. And the line between medicine and manipulation, the cure and control, it's getting thinner and thinner, and that's why I needed to dive into this conversation. We all know that eugenics is described as the ambition to shape humanity, to design a better future. But every time we try to define what better means, we reveal more about our fears than our dreams. Can we really improve humanity without losing the very thing that makes us human? In the first segment, when it comes to the birth of eugenics, we should really consider the historical context behind it. As you know, the eugenics really originated between late 19th to the earliest 20th century. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton. He was a British scientist and cousin of Charles Darwin. He defined it as the science of improving the human race through better breeding.
In its early adoption, eugenics gained popularity in the US, Britain, and parts of Europe. It was presented as a path to social progress. It encouraged reproduction among people with so called desirable traits, and discouraged or prevented it among those with undesirable traits through sterilization, institutionalization, or selective breeding.
And while Francis Galton first coined the term eugenics in 1883, it wasn't until Charles Davenport, who brought the movement to the United States, that it gained traction. Davenport, a biologist, founded the Eugenics Record Office in 1910, which became the epicenter for eugenic research and policy in America. His work shaped policies like forced sterilization and immigration restrictions, deeply embedding eugenics in the US history. So, now we're going on to the discussion part of this, and there are two questions that I would like to discuss with my co host that you listeners can ponder yourself. Are the seeds of modern racism and inequality rooted in the pseudoscience of eugenics? And how do we recognize when scientific authority becomes dangerous?
Well, I believe that the scientists first thought of eugenics as something to shape humanity into a better direction. If it would have stayed in the lane of helping humanity instead of hindering and trying to hide the mental disabilities ever existed, it could have been an amazing thing. Scientific authority becomes dangerous when you look at examples like the Nazis, who wanted specific racial genetics and would use any means necessary to get rid of what they view as undesirable traits.
And yeah, I agree with that as well. If they had actually helped with people with mental disabilities, it would have been great. Um, as well with the how the Nazi did, it was really on racial genetics because they really just want to focus on the German people only and not the Jews and the other gypsies and other races as well. And yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that. For me, I would say that the roots of modern inequality stretch deep into the soil of eugenics, and it wasn't just bad science. To me, it was a moral failure disguised as progress. When, like I believe, when science becomes and claims to define human worth, actually, I believe it stops being inquiry and becomes ideology. I think science becomes dangerous when it stops being a tool for discovery and becomes a weapon for control, especially when it's used to rank human worth or justify exclusions.
I can completely see where you're coming from because science is dangerous, because science is supposed to be discovery and helping, and it should never be used for control over any human.
Hmm. Basing it off of what you mentioned earlier with the Nazi Germany, um, eugenics was actually really deeply embedded by that Nazi ideology, and I can see how it did fuel policies of racial purification, and it did ultimately lead to the Holocaust. And while this episode deserves more time than we can give here, it is important to acknowledge that eugenics was a central pillar of the Nazi genocide. All right, now for the second question is could a benevolent scientific agenda today repeat the same atrocities? And what blind spots do we still have? And I'll answer first. So I would say yeah, that history does definitely show that even the most benevolent intentions can lead to harm when guided by unchecked authority. Atrocities don't always begin with malice, they often begin with certainty and certainty that we know what's best for others. It was born from a desire to sort of improve humanity, and I believe that the blind spot for that would be that even in today's time, 2025, there are people who believe and assume that improvement has a universal definition. And my question for that is like, who decides what's fit, who's normal, what's worthy? I believe that science stops listening. When science stops listening and starts labeling, that's kind of where I believe it loses it in humanity.
I completely see your point. Anything benevolent can be bastardized to repeat previous atrocities. As humans, many of us still want to see the good that things like eugenics can offer, but we're easily blinded from the horrific reality that it can also bring.
and going off from both of your answers, yeah, it does tend to have people blind from eugenics because they may think that it's good for the future, but for me, I believe that it's not good because it takes away our dignity and our human rights.
Mhm.
I completely see what both of you guys are saying in that.
I can agree. I can agree with both of you guys as well. Going on to our next segment, the dark legacy and how the U.S. Eugenics movement became prevalent. I would like to focus on the fact that forced sterilizations and immigration restrictions were central to the eugenics movement in the United States, as Charles Davenport was the one who did play a significant role in formalizing the movement, particularly through his work at the Eugenics Record Office, which influenced harmful policies like sterilization, marriage laws, and immigration restrictions. While he wasn't the only figure involved, his actions had a profound and lasting impact.
Yeah, but this wasn't just a few bad apples in history books. Our own institutions were complicit, and the echoes are still alive in medical mistrust and systemic inequality.
Awesome. I have a question for the both of you. So, how do we consider this trauma today, especially for marginalized communities?
Well, the only way to reckon and heal from trauma is to look at the horrible things our ancestors have done to these communities. Even if our families are not directly tied to these horrors, we as people need to learn from the past and change the future for the better.
Yeah, Becca, I can completely agree with that. I want to say that really that the healing begins when society dares to see its own reflection, not as it wishes to be, but as it truly is, and chooses not to really look away and honor the voices of those harmed and committing to justice that goes beyond words. Because to me, I believe that silence is a form of complicity. What about you, Teddy? What do you think about this?
Yeah, I do agree with you too. Um, as you said, healing begins when society dares to see its own reflection because of what the other ethnics has gone through. I do believe that, you know, trauma is not good for everyone, not just, of course, minorities, but other the other races as well. And yeah,
Yeah. Did you guys know that when it comes to eugenics, it was not just confined to the U.S. It was a global impact. For example, Sweden. It was a state-sponsored forced sterilization, which targeted people deemed unfit to reproduce, and that went from 1930 to 1970, including those with mental disabilities, ethnic minorities, and primarily it was a lot more women. It was said that there was an estimate around 63,000 people, like people in general, that were actually sterilized at the time.
Canada was doing it from 1920 to 1970. Provinces like Alberta and British Columbia passed forced sterilization laws. Victims included people with mental disabilities, indigenous communities, and others labeled as genetically inferior.
interesting. As well in Australia up to the 1970s, they practiced forced sterilization, especially in Western Australia, on Indigenous Australians and people with disabilities.
That's crazy.
Going on to our next segment, the dark legacy and how the U.S. eugenics movement became prevalent. I would like to focus on the fact that forced sterilizations and immigration restrictions were central to the eugenics movement in the United States, as Charles Davenport was the one who did play a significant role in formalizing the movement, particularly through his work at the Eugenics Record Office, which influenced harmful policies like sterilization, marriage laws, and immigration restrictions. While he wasn't the only figure involved, his actions had a profound and lasting impact.
Yeah, but this wasn't just a few bad apples in history books. Our own institutions were complicit, and the echoes are still alive in medical mistrust and systemic inequality.
On to segment 3, Eugenics Day. In the global trends, the Iceland is known for its quote near elimination of Down syndrome through prenatal testing and abortions, which raises ethical concerns about genetic selection and societal values and who gets to, you know, choose who gets to have babies and is it really a good thing?
Did you know there was someone named Ha Jungku that in China, he was a researcher who stunned the world in 2018 by announcing that he had helped produce genetically edited babies? Well, he's just been found guilty of conducting illegal medical practices and sentenced to 3 years in prison. A court in Shenzhen found that he and two collaborators forged ethical reviewing documents and misled doctors into unknowingly implanting gene edited embryos into two different women. One of the mothers gave birth to twin girls in November 2018, and it hasn't even been made clear when the third baby was born. The court ruled that the three defendants had deliberately violated national regulations on biomedical research and medical ethics and rashly applied gene editing technology to human reproductive medicine. And in November 2018, he announced that he had modified a key gene in a number of human embryos as a way to confer resistance to HIV. The modification might be passed on to the descendants of children born with it. He recruited couples in which the father was infected and the mother wasn't. And in a talk at the International Summit on Human Genome Editing in Hong Kong, China, he said he wanted to spare the babies the possibility of becoming infected later in life. The technique could be used to reduce the HIV/AIDS disease in, say, Africa, as he argued, where those infected often face discrimination. But the announcement touched off a firestorm of criticism in form of scientists and ethicists in attendance at the summit from around the world. All experts pretty much agree that there are safer and more effective ways to prevent HIV, and the experiment was deemed premature, irresponsible, and unjustified because it exposed those babies to risks associated with gene editing for little, if any, benefit.
Crazy.
When entire nations quietly encourage genetic improvement, are we witnessing evolution or social engineering?
It's a good question.
All right, you two. I have a question. Um, how do different cultures justify or question these practices, and what responsibilities does the global community have?
I think you should answer that one first.
All right. Well, I would say that different cultures justify genetic practices through the lens of their own values, whether it's ethical, religious, or social beliefs. Some see it as an opportunity to eliminate suffering, while others view it as tampering with the essence of life. But as a global community, I believe that we share the responsibility of setting a universal boundary, ensuring that the pursuit of genetic advancements doesn't really become a means of control, but remains a tool for a collective good.
Yeah, and some cultures justify these practices because their genetic ancestry has horrible diseases or undesirable features. But the global community has a responsibility to step in and say, it's okay to have these genetics, and we should be working on finding a true cure instead of a blanket just to cover the problem.
Okay, like
Nice.
that.
And yeah, I do agree with your answers. Um, all of the different cultures, they all have different practices for the genetic, have their own values and stuff. And yeah, and the global community, you know, should be able to and should always help each other and always finding a cure for what disease they have. And some other groups or ethnics, religion, they have different beliefs and different diseases or stuff like that. And yeah.
I can definitely see where you're coming from there, Teddy.
And also, did you know that social media plays a pivotal role in spreading information to the masses, especially in today's tech driven age? And also from the films like Gattaca. And it was made in 1997, the year that I was born. It's pretty cool. And which imagines a dystopian future where society embraces genetic perfectionism and discrimination. To TED Talks discussing CRISPR technology and the ethics of gene editing. Social media platforms like YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram amplify these conversations. While these discussions can spark important debates on the ethics of genetic medication, they often reduce complex issues to oversimplified narratives, shaping global perceptions in ways that may overlook the full moral implications.
Interesting, Teddy. I would say in 1997, I was actually 2 years old.
I was 3, so I think I was at that point too young to even see Gattaca.
Yeah.
Right.
Which then leads us to an interesting question. Are we oversimplifying the ethics, or are we finally making them more accessible? Personally, I think we're oversimplifying ethics. You can polish a turd and it's still a turd. Real people are drastically impacted by the decisions of these things. And if we don't have a conversation and bring ethics into the discussion, I think we're acting blind to the truth.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I do agree with that. We are simplifying it, and things that they do, it, it's not that hard. Like you said, um, yeah,
Yeah, I really do like the word choices. I do believe that it is more easier to talk about the genes and traits in an abstract term, but the reality of all of this is far messier, and it impacts real people from families, lives, and futures. And by oversimplifying the conversation, I believe that we risk ignoring the emotional and moral complexities that come with it, making it easier to accept but harder to truly understand.
Which makes total sense. Hypothesis in science is completely fine until you start putting into real world practice, and that's where you need to bring ethics into the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now to the next segment. It's about the future of humanity against, well, eugenics. Um, Eugenics began with the promise of a better human race by deciding who was worthy of their genes. And today and in the future, there's a promise that has been rebranded as an enhancement. Smarter, stronger, longer living humans, but improvement for whom and of what cost?
and the line between healing and controlling is thin, even speaking in terms of our time right now. When society quietly agrees that certain minds or bodies, be it autism, ADHD, Down syndrome, are less desirable, we aren't moving forward. We're circling back to a science that claimed to be perfect humanity by erasing the differences, what makes us who we are.
Would I want to live in a world where everyone's genetically optimized? Would I even have a choice?
And I do have a question in particular that comes with, our discussion is, does genetic enhancements lead us to a sort of a utopia or a terrifying new hierarchy?
I personally think it will lead us to a terrifying hierarchy. There will always be a way to put the
Mm-hmm.
poor and minority communities down. Genetic enhancement could become something only the wealthy can afford. What makes a rich person's kid more deserving than a lower class child? If we can eliminate cancer or disease, or honestly whatever, why can't we do it for all? These are things that the hierarchy will keep from the minority so they can still have control over them.
I really do like your answer, and I can see how it would be a hierarchy on, who gets it and who doesn't. For me, I do believe that genetic enhancement sounds pretty progressive. And as you said, I do believe it also becomes currency, as you've also mentioned, to the privileged who can afford it. And then it stops being considered an evolution and starts becoming a division, forgetting that humanity's beauty ties into the imperfections. But when it comes to, as you said, cancer or anything that could be fixed, where does it draw the line of who gets it and who doesn't based off of, what currency you have at the time?
And those are great answers. And I do agree with that too. And I believe that genetic enhancement, it is a progress. It's going to take time. And as the new hierarchy, I believe that, it's leading up to there, but I feel like we're not there yet. Or maybe it could slide off and not be the new terrifying hierarchy, but it's basically globally known to a lot of people, but they chose not to care about it. But but anyways, off topic. I do believe that the AI and robots that could possibly take over the world.
Well, we can't, genetically modify robots as they're not genetic material, so.
I mean, you could be the next cyborg.
Oh
Yeah,
gosh.
that that'd be crazy.
Well, and then we think about the global impact. Nations may begin to embrace this new concept of genetic engineering as part of their identity or as a strategy to gain global dominance. But that raises a deeper question. Is this progress or simply a new form of control, echoing the same manipulative ideals that eugenics once used to shape entire populations? I have a pretty thought provoking question. If genetics becomes a geopolitical tool, do we risk turning entire populations into products of national ambition?
Yes, I do believe that we are risking turning our people, all the populations, the people, into products of national ambitions because it's not even about having an identity no more. It's basically just about us being used as an object or a tool for a lot of things like war and doing other dumb things.
Yeah, I can see your vision. Um, I do believe that when genes eventually do become instruments of power, people stop being individuals, like Teddy said, They become more of a strategy. It's no longer about your identity, it's about possession. Who can engineer and produce the strongest, most useful group, if that means, eradicating races or, editing genes to become a better race.
Exactly. And that brings me back to the Nazis. If they would have succeeded in just the genetic ambition, how many Germans, or even Europeans in general, would look the same? Blonde hair, blue eyes? And if we're being honest, would a nation's ambitions stop at their own country, or would they take it globally to conform to their ideal genetics?
That's crazy because I do believe that they would have ended up going further
Yeah.
into like Europe and not just focusing, on the small demographic that they did have.
Well, and if you don't even just look at the Nazis, if
Mm-hmm.
someone from a different country is trying to make the perfect person, why would they stop at their country? Wouldn't they want the entire globe to fit their ideal?
True. Very true. All right, on to the next segment, the roundtable discussion. It's a deep dive for me and my co-hosts. For all of you listening, you guys can ponder as well. For the first question, I would like to ask if you could eliminate a future illness in your child, but the procedure also boosts traits like height, intelligence, and or even beauty. Would you say yeah? And what does that say about our values?
Well, personally, I think if we wanted to make a better future for our children, then we'd be working on cures instead of, again, blanketing issues. And once you begin fixing illnesses, cancer, genetically, deemed unworthy traits, when you boost high intelligence and, how hot someone is, that's just vain. The values become null and void because now if you're just doing the illnesses, then that's great. But again,
Mhm.
our poor people, our minorities going to be able to afford this? It's ethically wrong to think that it's ethically wrong in general to think that we can just get rid of what we don't like.
Mhm.
Yeah. I do agree with that, with your answer, because it is ethically wrong and physically, basically, too, and financially. All the minorities, or not just minorities, everyone, how can they afford it when, if it's super expensive to do that? And for me, personally, I wouldn't um, do it to boost their trait or their height and stuff like that, because that would affect basically who you are, your identity, because you're just trying to be a perfect person, which it's better to be imperfect than perfect because you're trying to be like everyone else and not yourself. So, in the value, yeah, it would devalue. I believe that it would devalue ourselves and all the things that who you say you are.
Hmm. I can agree. I agree with the way you both have actually have answered that. For me, I was thinking it was a very hard choice. I want to say yes if it meant like preventing an illness that could seriously impact my child, like my child's quality of life. My motivation itself wouldn't be to essentially make them smarter or, in Becca's terms, hotter. It would be to reduce like just their basic suffering. I believe that in protecting a child's dignity and giving them the best chances for fulfilling life, and not just shaping them to fit an ideal, as it's about the compassion over the perfection. And I believe that it shows that I value a human experience over the external expectations that come with it. But I can see your guys' point in the idea that, as a minority or if someone that doesn't have the money, you're not going to have the means to be able to essentially eliminate an illness that could lead to, death or anything like that.
Well, and who's honestly to say that the scientist that's going to genetically change your child's genome is going to stop at the illness that you wanted to prevent? They could go against ethics and make them hotter, smarter, more inclined. You look at things like celebrities already do it. Chrissy Teigen and John Legend have 3 embryos, and I know of 2 of them. Their son is genetically altered to be more into sports, and their daughter is to be more into like ballet and dance and girly things.
That is crazy. I don't think I
That is
could
crazy.
justify that.
Well, and that's what it comes down to. When we start saying yes to genetically engineering anything, what's going to stop humanity or even scientists like that one that is in prison for 3 years from taking it a step further even without your knowledge?
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, part of this discussion, did you guys know in the early 20th century, people with mental disabilities, autism, Down syndrome, even ADHD were often targeted by sterilization laws under the belief that it weakened society? You fast forward to today, if we could eliminate these conditions before birth, should we? Or would we be erasing valuable ways of thinking and being human, including the idea of sterilization?
I don't think that these conditions should be treated the same. As autism and ADHD, for example, they come with their own unique strengths, and they do live meaningful lives. Just because you have ADHD or you're autistic doesn't mean you're not gonna, thrive. And I'm not saying that people with Down syndrome lack that either, but their situation's a little more complex. It's not the same. Although they do have their own, capabilities. I believe rather than erasing these like possibilities of, okay, you have ADHD, you have autism, you have Down syndrome, I believe that we should focus on the education and support, because people do deserve the right to make informed choices, not to be pushed by the fear or the stigma behind it. And, oh, your kid's going to be autistic. Oh no, my whole life is ruined because I have an autistic child. When essentially that autistic kid could honestly be the cure to cancer.
Well, honestly, though, I have autism and ADHD, and I lead a completely normal, fulfilling life. I think differently, and sometimes I'm a bit more hyper. But I don't think that we should get rid of those because, you have your savants out there. They think completely differently. They, are geniuses, and that's fine. I do have to say, as someone who has had mental disabilities in their family, I can understand the sterilization, per se, of people with things like Down syndrome. My younger sister has mosaic syndrome, which is the opposite of Down syndrome, but it's just as debilitating. She'll never reach more than a 9-year old's ability to think. And we've been crushing birth control pills in her food since she began menstruating. And then, obviously, later in life, she could just take the pills. But the thing about it is we were told that if she had a child, it could kill her, and if she did have a child, that it could be 10 times worse than her. And I guess at that point, the parent of the disabled uh, person has to think, can I raise, at the same time of me constantly forever until I die, raising my child, can I raise their child? And not everyone's on the same spectrum of Down syndrome. Some people need
Mhm.
lifelong care, like my sister. Others, I've known Down syndrome people and worked with them personally that could live on their own, but they still need to be given all of the options and letting them know that if you have a child, this child could be, worse off than you are mentally. And you have to look at how the person with the mental illness or mental disability or anything is going to react to having that child. Because at that point, are we just bringing more babies into this world that need more care? Because a child with a mental disability does need more care.
Yeah, I agree with all of it, and I believe, having or people who has or have Down syndrome or ADHD or autism, I believe that it's a blessing that we can learn from them as well too, knowing how to support them, how to help them. Um, and it's just sad how they want to get rid of those kind of people. And but it depends on the parents too if they want to sterilize them before birth. But personally, I you know wouldn't do that. I Having babies or having a kid is it's a blessing, and they deserve the right to the people or the parents deserve the right to know before making that decision and not to be forced or any or any way, yeah.
And I completely
Yeah,
see
I can
where
see
you're
that.
coming from on that. And that's the thing. I truly believe, like my sister, and I spent many years at the same schools. We're only 10 months apart. So, having been around the disabled community my entire life, they are all a blessing. But I have seen
Hmm.
horrible parents who cannot take care of their children because they view them not as a blessing, but as a curse.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I see a lot of parents when their kids have any sort of disability, they want to find every excuse and, not think maybe it is genetic. I mean, I have an aunt who thinks her son has autism because of the vaccines, you know.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and that held on to her for a hot minute until I eventually told her, it is genetic, but him having autism isn't going to make him any less. It's, everyone has their capabilities, and regardless of if they have ADHD or autism or Down syndrome, everyone has the capabilities to bring greatness, and I think when you take that away, you're taking away an individuality that could progress the world in a better way, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
No,
Yeah.
and that makes total sense. And to speak about your aunt, my sister's father has my sister and my little brother, and they both, my brother's perfectly, fine mentally.
Mhm.
Their father decided that he made excuses for years. Maybe that's not my kid. I can't be, this can't be my fault. This isn't genetically on me. Even though his sister has a child with Down syndrome, and it is from their side of the family that the chromosome deformations happened.
Mm. Mhm.
But he couldn't accept it because, you know, even though in my eyes, Brittany is perfect. She's the sweetest, most caring. Well, she's gotten to be the most sweetest caring. She had some problems in her teenage years. Don't we
Yeah.
all, though?
We all do.
Um,
Yeah.
but she's an amazing human being, and I've learned so much from her.
Mhm.
Wow.
she's honestly
yeah,
my
and
best friend.
awesome. Yeah, for me, I have a well, yeah, I guess she's another grandma as well. She lives in Minnesota, and this was back when she was in Laos during the Vietnam War, where they had to cross over the Mekong River, and she had a son who was just a newborn, and she had to hide and stay quiet and what is it? Use this. She had to use a drug called opium to make her child to fall asleep so that they wouldn't hear the baby crying, and then that affected the child, and he grew up, and he, I guess, he grew up as hard of hearing, and I guess can't really speak. I don't know how to say it. Um, but yeah, and I love him. He's older than me too, but he's basically just another older brother to me. I love him. He loves the Green Bay Packers, even though he lives in Minnesota, which is funny. But yeah, and er, he would always come visit us, and whenever they have time, and yeah, because like it's a blessing. It's just crazy how what they went through, but yeah.
Well, it seems
That's
like
crazy.
me and you both, Teddy, have been touched personally
Mm,
by people that, society sometimes views as unfit.
yeah.
Mhm.
Well, on to our last question. If you have to enhance your child to compete in society, is it really a choice or a new form of coercion?
I want to say that I believe that if the pressure to enhance your children become a norm just to keep up with society, I don't believe it's like a choice anymore. And the idea of choosing to enhance feels less like a freedom and more like you're conforming to the external expectations. And I can see it being a tough dilemma because while you want to give your child the opportunity, I believe that we should, just accept, you know, who your child is, regardless of if, if they're going to be genetically inclined to keep up with society or not. And I think it just takes away from us as a society if you just want to, have everyone be, enhanced.
No, I completely see where you're coming from. And, like, that's the thing. Even if, you know, my child needed to. Because I have a, 11-year-old son. And in some ways, he already can't compete in society. He has ADHD, like me. He, has trouble reading. Sometimes, he has problems with reading questions before answering them. So he already is struggling to keep up in a society that views him as unfit. And the thing about it is what people, don't see, and you want us to, enhance these children intellectually, you know, make them more attractive, which is weird. Um, you want to do all these things when, even though my son is not a very good reader, he's not a good, mathematician. He is an amazing kid, and he's sweet, caring, loves baking, and he's good at it. So if I enhance him to have all these smarts, what is he going to lose? Is he going to lose that kind, compassionate nature? Is he going to lose the like passion that he has for people and animals and cooking? If I choose one, do I have to risk the other?
Wow. Yeah, I agree, and I like you guys' answers. And yeah, if I had to do that, I would say no. Um, I have a friend who has or has scoliosis, but he went through surgery. It turned out great, and that didn't affect him because he still knows how to play the piano because scoliosis doesn't affect him or any shape, way, or form. Just because
Mhm.
he couldn't, bend over or bend backwards. He's all great. He's strong. I love that guy, and yeah, it's it's not personally. I don't like it, and because it defeats the purpose of being yourself,
Mhm.
identity. You know, because why would you want to compete in a society where you always have to change every single time? Because that's exhausting. You're not being yourself. You're not being your true self. But
Mhm.
yeah,
It's kind of like how we in society keep up with, fashion and beauty
yeah,
standards, and but to implement it on a child, like, going back to you, Becca, your kid is the sweetest, even though like our kids fight like siblings.
They
Um,
do.
you know, I look back and I think, yeah, it would definitely change the child because they are who they are with the way they think. And by changing that, even if it's considered enhancing, you know, and it all leads back to eugenics because who's to say what's better and what's worse?
mm,
At the end of the day, you are who you are. And
yeah,
enhancing anything to keep up with society, like you said, Teddy, is it's just gonna be exhausting. It's
yeah,
overwhelming and it's exhausting.
Well, and medical professionals already try to coerce people. I remember being 12 years old and we found out that I have something called pectus excavatum, meaning my chest caves in.
mm,
And
wow,
they, and mind you, the surgery to fix that, let me paint you a picture, is they put a metal rod in your chest and then they turn it so that it pops out your
Oh.
chest and
ouch,
it breaks your sternum and your ribs. And at 12 years old, they tried to get my grandmother to do the surgery to me just so that, honestly, it doesn't really affect me besides like being able to go on like
mm,
certain rides at a
Mhm.
fair because my chest doesn't have the volume that others. So things like the press down is worse, any
yeah,
kind of like force, even air force.
mm,
But they tried to tell her that I wouldn't live fulfilling life. Even though I wasn't really in pain, I wasn't really, it wasn't affecting me. I still played basketball, I still played sports.
Mhm.
It just was harder.
It was
I had to
it
work
was more of a
harder.
societal thing, huh?
Yeah, it was more society. And my grandma pretty much told the doctor to shove it. She wasn't going to put her 12-year-old granddaughter through a horribly painful surgery, open chest surgery,
Mhm.
just to, make me, in all honesty, look better.
mm.
Look
So
That's
more
crazy.
crazy.
normal. So if doctors are coercing patients for, again, what they deem fit now, if we
Mhm.
let eugenics take hold and let, society make us enhance children, how bad is the coercion going to get?
Mhm.
Yeah,
And in a closing reflection to and coming to a conclusion, I would like to say that eugenics isn't just a shadow of the past. It's a conversation that we must keep having and ask ourselves how far are we willing to go in our quest to perfect humanity, and who gets to define what perfect really means, from race to mental disabilities to whatever.
You know,
In the future, are we going to become so genetically modified that it wouldn't be about trying to stop an illness and but instead pushing for the future where we are in ourselves?
I completely understand with your closing reflection. And I think for me personally, I look at it and I didn't know how far eugenics went back and how much it has impacted, the entire globe.
mm. Yeah. I agree what you guys said. It is interesting. I never knew that it was from that far too, from way back, and it is a crazy and cool topic to talk about.
I think it's interesting that it's going to continue in the future.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll ever end.
Probably not.
All right, congrats, listeners! You've officially survived a deep dive into eugenics without being labeled unfit. Gold star for genetic fitness, or simply just for paying attention. Signing off, Audrey.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to our talk here with the topic. And signing off, Teddy. Goodbye. Crazy style.
And this is it for me, Becca. I hope everyone has a morally ethic day.